the weekly show with David J. Maloney. This week, David chats with Steve Luongo of the John Entwistle Band. And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to the weekly show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got a really special guest. He rose to fame with his first band, Rat Race Choir, and would go on to become one of the pioneers of the electronic percussion movement in the 1970s and 80s. As a friend, band member, and longtime collaborator of John Entwistle and the John Entwistle Band, he is continuing the legacy of John's music with the release of two incredible reissues, Oxhumed Volume 1 and Volume 2. Here to chat about it all after the break is none other than drummer Steve Luongo. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight started playing professionally at a young age with his band Rat Race Choir and became one of the major pioneers of electronic percussion instruments in the 1970s. He went on to become a longtime friend to and collaborator with the late, great John Entwistle. And as a member of the John Entwistle Band, he's continuing the legacy of John's music with the release of two incredible reissues, Oxhumed Volume 1 and now Volume 2. Here to chat about it all is none other than drummer Steve Luongo. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we talk about the John Entwistle reissues, I'd love to learn more about the journey that brought you to this moment. How did your music journey start, and how early were you introduced to your first drum set?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And in fact, I was reminded of how the journey started by a friend of mine from elementary school that I'm still friendly with. A friend of mine named Janice reminded me that in kindergarten, believe it or not, the high school band came to our elementary school to do a concert. And my mother, who was a big music fan and a big fan of the band leader at the high school, had got me all pumped up. Oh, you're going to love this. And I had never heard live music. I don't think I've ever heard it anywhere, much less in an auditorium with all the ambience. Mm-hmm. So we're all sitting there. The sixth graders are down in front, fifth, fourth, and so on, up to the balcony where the kindergartners were. And I was leaning on the railing next to my friend Janice. And the minute I heard them start playing, I was instantly absorbed by the sound in the room. And when the drums started playing, I stopped completely and turned to Janice and said, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. No idea where that came from. But
how old were you at that time, would you say?
Five, maybe. Yeah, five, I guess, right? And yeah. And that was it. From that point on, she told me every day somehow you got drumsticks and you always had them in your pocket and blah, blah, blah. And I pestered my family for a drum set, and I got one of those little cowboy drum sets with the paper heads, and I shredded that pretty quick. And so I was dying to take lessons or to play because I knew there were drums in the school. And unfortunately, in my elementary school, White Plains, America Avenue School, you couldn't take lessons until you were in fourth grade. So here I am now, first, second, third, I'm going nuts. And so I started to play on my own. And by the time I got to fourth grade, I was already playing. I had been playing for years on my mother's tea set and whatever else I could hit with a hammer or a stick. And so that really started it. I don't ever remember a time in my life when I wasn't playing music, except obviously in those very, very early preschool years. And lucky for me, I grew up in garden apartments where there were other kids that happened to be musicians. And the guy who wound up being the bass player and singer in Rat Race Choir was my neighbor. And we put a band together called the Continentals when we were very young, before we had even heard of the Beatles, I think 62, 63, something like that. So I was
That's such a 60s band name too, by the way.
Right, exactly. Well, the third guy in the band was our friend Jan, whose father was a jazz sax player. Jan played the trumpet. So the singer from Rat Race wasn't playing bass yet. He was still playing accordion. So we were the Continentals. We even had the Continental theme. I can't remember how it went, but I'm sure this was all influenced by Jan's dad, who was a serious musician. And then the Beatles happened, 64. Dave, the accordion player, decided bass might be a little bit more appropriate. Jan wound up, leaving the band. We got a guitar player, and things evolved into that. And of course, influenced by the Beatles, we were the Bugs, and then we were the Roaches, and we were, and finally in '68, after a couple of iterations of the band, Dave and I started Rat Race Choir, and of course, it was the music of the day. So it's late '60s into the early '70s, and we're playing all of the stuff. We started off early playing Motown and things like that, box tops, and just a myriad of songs. And we didn't care. We weren't genre specific. We'd do Light My Fire, and then we'd do Young Girl. So it was, it was just an eclectic. We just played everything. And very much when I heard Live at Leeds for the first time, I said, that really sparked something in me. That and Jimi Hendrix, and certainly Cream. Those three bands musically set a tone for me because they were improvisational, they were aggressive. All three of those drummers were players. They were not just timekeepers. No disrespect to timekeepers, but that's what appealed to me, to be a lead drummer, so to speak. And if you're in a trio or even a quartet, there's a lot of room to move around as a drummer. And so I was very much inspired by Ginger Baker and Keith Moon and Mitch Mitchell, three of my absolute favorites. I have to include Dino Dinelli as my token timekeeper because I was a Rascals fan from the very early days. But that's how it started. I mean, and it was just so much fun playing covers, because all of a sudden you were playing your favorite music. And we were invited by our sound man, who said, I happen to be the head engineer at Warner Brothers in the Brill building, which is, at the time was a 4-track studio. And he said, I can get you guys in there if you want. And we said, great. We loaded our stuff in. And then he said, well, what do you want to record? And it was like, whoa. So we had to write some material on the spot. And that's how it started, '68 in the studio. And, the rest, it kind of just ramped up from there. And playing with Rat Race, we were blessed to be as successful as we were. And I was blessed with 3 other musicians that were just staggeringly good. And we played everything. Again, of course, now we were doing Mahavishnu Orchestra and The Who and Jethro Tull. And so we learned all this material, made it our own, so to speak. And by the time I got to the NAMM show in '87, where I met John Entwistle, we could play just about anything with just about anybody. And so that's the somewhat edited path to where I am.
We mentioned before the interview, we were talking about us kind of growing up in the same area code. I know you were born in Westchester, New York. Is that where you spent most of your early years? And if so, what was the music scene like there growing up?
Well, there wasn't a huge music scene in Westchester. I mean, we had a Sam Ash, and there were a lot of players around, but the scene was really out on Long Island and in New York City. And mistakenly, because we had a lot of success out on the island, people thought we were a Long Island band. But that's where the whole thing was right place, right time. You hear about these halcyon moments in music history, like the Valley or San Francisco or or Greenwich Village, and the late '60s through the '70s was a great time for concert rock, so to speak, on Long Island. And we went out to the Hamptons, to a place called Middy's General Store in 1971, and we had a residency there. We were there for the whole summer. We hooked up with a manager who was a bartender there, and one thing led to another. And in that first year, our sound man, who was the engineer at Warner Brothers, developed a quadraphonic PA. So in 1971, we had a full quadraphonic PA. We had stacks, and I had a double set of drums, and we just went equipment crazy. And it was just right place, right time. And the clubs started getting bigger and bigger. They were turning into like small theaters or big, venues with 2 stages and multiple bands. And it was really, the drinking age was 18. And we were playing six nights a week for the entire year. So you're playing 300 gigs a year. You get pretty good after 5 or 10 years of doing that. And,
Now, when you first started, though, you were what, like 16-ish, right? Is that when Rat Race Choir was formed, somewhere around that?
Yeah, 68. So I would have been 15, 16.
So were you gigging and performing while you were essentially trying to finish high school, I'm guessing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think we started gigging. I was still in junior high school. And in fact, the Middies thing, I remember the first year out in the Hamptons, I had to go back to school because school started in the fall. They were still having gigs, or I'd have to go out after Memorial Day to play weekends and have to hustle home to get back to school. And yeah, that would have been ninth grade. So yeah, it was crazy. And needless to say, school suffered.
Well, were your parents and family supportive, or were they worried that it was all too soon and maybe not stable enough?
Well, my parents were divorced, so it was just my mother, my brother, and myself. My brother was 8 years older than me, so he was on his own journey. And my mother encouraged me to play, and I had an uncle who was a uncle by marriage who was a pro, played in a big band in New York, and she took me over to meet with my uncle so that he could have the talk with me. It's a hard business. It's this, it's that. And I wasn't hearing any of it. Don't forget, somehow innately, I knew what I wanted to do from 5 years old. So that's 10 years ago. So you're not going to talk me out of this. And I know what I want to do. I enjoy doing it. From what I can gather, I'm pretty good at doing it. And I love it. So there's not much of a discussion to have. My mother talked to me about college. I said, it's not what I want to do. I don't want I wouldn't know what to study in college, and it just was a non-starter for me. So I knew that I wanted to be successful. And truthfully, in high school, I was making more money than my teachers. So it was a hard argument to have, I'm driving a very nice car and I'm wearing very nice clothes and living a very nice life. And it was hard to discipline me because guess what? I'm doing this. You're telling me I shouldn't, but I thinking I should. Working. Yeah. I'm working you're working a 40-hour week. I'm working a 40-hour month and I'm making bank. So it was just, like I said, again, right time, right place. If you try to do that today, I don't know if the infrastructure is there. The music scene, there was only one place in White Plains that we could play called the 4.5 South. There was another place in Yorktown called Gemini. And there was a 4.5 North in Brewster, but it was scattered. So the clubs were coming up, they were big enough and far enough apart that you weren't violating anybody's radius clause, which I don't even know if they had in those days. It was unbelievable. And the work was always there. And we were so young, still teenagers, it was like a dream. It wasn't like you were being overworked. It was amazing and just amazing opportunities to grow. You didn't have to rehearse because you were playing every night and you just got to try new things. It was a magical time. And then the drinking age changed and things changed and, so it goes, but a magical time.
Now, you were a pioneer of electronic percussion in the 70s, and I'm just curious, what fascinated you most about the possibilities there?
Well, we were equipment crazy, so any new thing that came out, I wanted to know what it was. And back in the early 70s, there was the Mini Moog, so our keyboard player had not one but two Mini Moogs. And I was in Sam Ash and in White Plains, and I think it was Sammy Ash, young Sammy Ash, said, got something cool, and shows me this thing called a Moog drum, which is like a little tom-tom with a wire coming out of the bottom of it and a couple of knobs on the side of it. I said, what does it do? He said, let's plug it in. And he plugged it into a Mini Moog, and it was like, wow. And I said, who has this? And he said, Billy Cobham is the only other guy that has one. And I said, wow, was this a prototype? And he said, yeah. And so I bought it immediately, and I used to use it in my solos. And the things that I could do with it were so different. and it was, you could see it because I used to have it propped up in right in the middle of my set, so that when I was playing it and you were hearing the percussive sound, it was like, it was synth sounds, but it was like, what is that? No one had ever heard anything like that before. And anything that came out synth percussion wise, syn drum, any of that stuff, I just had to have it, and I got it. And, luckily we were making enough money where I could just buy whatever I wanted. And it opened up the palette, the musical palette for me. I was all of a sudden making sounds that you couldn't make before. I mean, I had the gong, I even had the orchestra chimes, but now all of a sudden here was this new dimension, and it was phenomenal. So that's what got me started. And I would never sacrifice one for the other, or rather incorporate them together.
Well, and I remember, Neil Peart drum solos that would incorporate so many of those things where he would go into even a little bit of a jazz, drum, solo in the midst of another solo, and mix and match and mix. And that reminds me of what you said earlier. A 3-piece band gives you a lot of latitude.
Man, it really does. And I had that latitude. Everybody was willing to give everybody else space. And sometimes we played as a trio, but yeah, it was just, and Neil certainly took it to his own place and did his own thing with it. But yeah, the minute I heard that sound and the minute I realized I could do something other than make a tom-tom or a cymbal sound, I wanted everything I could get to do with that. And I actually still have it, and I still use it or use synths in my solos, and I love it. It's just a new landscape for drummers.
Now, you've produced, played with, and written with countless luminaries of the industry, from Alan Parsons to Todd Rundgren to Ann Wilson. But I think it's safe to say that something special happened when you met The Who's John Entwistle. How did that first meeting happen, and did you guys hit it off immediately?
Well, yes. How it happened was we had a sound engineer friend that worked at one of the Jersey clubs. Big fan of the band, big fan of Mark Hitt, our guitar player. And he would do the music conventions. Music Messe was the Germany version of NAMM, which is the convention in the United States. There's 2 of them, one in January out on the West Coast, and a summer one in June on the East Coast, or close. And so it was the summer of '87, and Joe Berger had gone to Music Messe and was lucky enough to jam with John Entwistle. Don't forget, in '86, '87, '85, The Who hadn't played since whatever it was, '81. It was over. They did, whatever shows they did, but there was really no touring. There was no records. There was nothing happening then. And John was just a compulsive musician. He had to be out playing. So he got onto the NAMM shows, and he would go. That's, when everybody, whatever you endorse, I endorse Zildjian and Vader and this and that and the other thing. And so those companies would bring you out, and you would do signings. And then at night, after NAMM shut down, there would be jams all around, in this case, all around Chicago, which great place to jam, Chicago. And so you could go to the Limelight, or any of the hotels would have satellite jams in the lobby, and it was just music week in Chicago. So Joe rang us up and said, I just got back from Germany. I guess it had to be March or something. And he said, I played with John Entwistle, and I told him about you guys talking about Rat Race, because we did all that Who material. We did, Quadrophenia, Tommy, Live at Leeds, did all that stuff. And he said he wants to meet you guys. So we were at McCormick Place in 1987, June, the weekend of the 27th, oddly enough. And here comes John walking down the street, in the middle, broad daylight, 2:00 in the afternoon, wearing his whole, rock and roll leather jacket and the spider and and he comes up, and Joe says, John, Steve, da-da-da, and he introduces us around the horn. And I said to him, you want to jam? And he said, anytime, mate. I took that as a license to steal. I went down onto the NAMM floor. Now I'm finding, this was my first NAMM, now I'm finding out that there are jam sessions that go on. I'm finding out all about this NAMM culture. And so in the course of the day, I said, who does the biggest jam? And they said, oh, Kramer. At this time, Eddie Van Halen was playing Kramer, Neil Schon, Leslie West, Dweezil Zappa. Everybody was playing Kramer. And they were having a big jam at the Vic Theater, which is, holds a few thousand people. So I went over to the Kramer booth and boldly declared, I'm playing with John Entwistle and we'd like to jam. They said, oh, you're playing with John Entwistle? Okay. And they got out the list and they moved this one backwards and this one forwards and slotted us in there. And they said, we'll send a car for you. And I said, oh, okay. I mean, I'm like oblivious, right? Now, if you don't book your accommodations for NAMM 6 months in advance, you could be staying in a tent behind the Hyatt, right? And as it turned out, I'm staying at the Cheese Box Motel on East Nowhere Street. And they send this ridiculous stretch limousine that was bigger than the front of my motel. And I get in it and I said, Drake, please take me to the Drake on whatever it was, Lakeshore Drive. And we drive down there and the guy gets out of the car, driver gets out of the car, pages John, and John comes down with his roadie. Roadie puts the bass in the trunk, gets in the front seat with the driver, and John and I are in the back seat of this ridiculous car. Now, he doesn't know who I am. He knows that Joe was all made up about us, but I mean, I'm nobody to know. It's, I'm a kid in a cover band that played some original materials and had some regional luck. And so he says to me, what are we going to play? And I said, we'll play some Who songs. And he says, I don't know any. And I said, well, we'll teach them to you. And that's exactly what happened. We get to the Vic, we get hustled down. We're in a typical vaudevillian style alleyway leading down to the dressing rooms. Go out of the car, down this dressing room stairs. We're in the dressing room, and the guys come in, the rest of the guys in the band, and they start going over Live at Leeds and this and Tommy and Pinball Wizard and whatever else we did. And he says, you guys even learned the mistakes. He said, okay, if you made the mistakes, we learned them. We thought they were supposed to be there. They happened every time we played the record, so we learned them. And he had no idea that we were going to go out on a stage full of equipment sponsored by Kramer and Seymour Duncan in the Vic Theater, which is a proper theater, with a balcony. There had to be 3,500 people there, sold out, packed to the rafters. And he had no idea, who he was getting on stage with. Luckily, we could actually do what, we needed to do. And you can see there's video of it. It's the first notes I ever played with the guy on stage. And I have it on video. This one shot it that night. And you can see him get relieved when he realized we were going to be able to sing and play these songs. And when I was just playing in Rat Race with a different bass player. I wasn't like trying to ape Keith Moon or play to John Entwistle. I was just doing what I was doing what I always did, just play. And it happened that we clicked. We clicked as a rhythm section. And it was an amazing thing because half the time I'm like, yeah, man, this guy can play. And the other half of the time it's like, that's John Entwistle, so yeah. It was stunning, but it felt right. And I guess he was so relieved that we didn't embarrass him that we sat talking for the rest of the night because we really did click as a rhythm section. And we were in the green room head to head telling jokes back and forth, and we found that we had a lot in common. And so I had to leave because I had an early flight the next morning, and he took a piece of paper and put it in my hand and said, stay in touch, mate. And I did.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. And a special thanks to Steve Luongo for joining us. Steve's going to be back again with us next week for the next part of our interview, so please tune back in. Stay safe, everyone.